When Pendulum monsters were first announced, Yu-Gi-Oh! Players were trying to figure out what the next big deck would be before they were even released. And for a brief period of time, it looked like that would have been Scrap Pendulum. Now that might sound like a horrendous combination for a deck, but trust me, it's a lot better than it sounds. Though it never really went anywhere because nobody played this deck in real life. With access to fan-run online simulators like Dueling Network and Yugioh Pro, duelists were able to playtest with cards basically as soon as they were revealed. Like, there doesn't even have to be a clean image most of the time as long as the effect is clear. So it basically became its own format, a testing ground utilizing OCG cards with a TCG audience. And Scrap Pendulum just happened to be one of the hot decks for about a month. At this point in time, the main Pendulum monsters revealed were Time Gazer and Stargazer Magician and Odd Eyes Pendulum Dragon. You know, the ones that would later come in the starter deck. Being pretty generic monsters with a wide range of scales and a monster that could search either piece while coming back onto the field every turn. These three monsters became known as the Pendulum package, and so now the only question was what deck should we run these in? And I guess the answer was Scrap. Scrap is an archetype that was introduced during the 5Ds era, a myriad of earth monsters that have effects revolving around destroying themselves in order to trigger some handy effects, all in service of eventually synchro summoning, though they never really went anywhere because a lot of the effects were just too costly or didn't work well enough. One of their boss monsters, Scrap Dragon, was a generic synchro with a good effect, so that was the main one that saw any play. It's not like Scrap monsters were terrible, they honestly had some good support like Scrap Storm and Scrap Yard. Hypothetically, Scrap Golem would be crazy if you get it on the field, and Scrap Chimera is a decent Wolfberg type effect. To top it all off, they got a brand new field spell, Scrap Factory, which allows you to replace monsters that get destroyed. And if that wasn't enough, the aforementioned starter deck would also include Supply Squad, which allows you to draw cards if one of your monsters is destroyed. So altogether, we had a solid enough archetype that thrives on recycling, as well as a means to summon multiple monsters per turn. Add in powerful synchro monsters like Scrap Dragon and Scrap Twin Dragon, as well as the ever-present Odd Eyes, and you've got a pretty good looking deck. And honestly, it was just really cool to play this online and felt like it would be the next big thing. So what happened? Well, the deck was never really perfect. The truth is that while the Pendulum monsters seem like a great way to enable summoning more monsters, they didn't really do anything beyond that. The goal was to never actually summon any of them except for Odd Eyes, and the Pendulum effects of the two magicians weren't all that helpful otherwise. Also, while Time Gazer feels very generous being an 8 scale, it has a restriction that you can only activate it if you don't control any monsters. So the Pendulum engine as a whole, not only for this deck, was honestly more of a hindrance unless you got exactly what you needed. Compare this to how future Pendulum decks would begin to take shape, where every card contributed something and could be a piece of a scale. It wasn't that Scrap and Pendulum were a bad mix, they were just too different to be the perfectly oiled machine that Pendulum could be in the future. And then there's the fact that only a month after the starter decks released, the first full set of the Arc V era would begin with Duelist Alliance, which included Tellarknight, Yangshing, Shadow, and a little TCG exclusive archetype called Burning Abyss. It wasn't really that Scrap Pendulum wasn't able to keep up, but more so that they just fell apart by the time the necessary pieces were finally printed in paper. It was a strange case where a relatively strong deck only existed in an unofficial fan-made simulator. Again, there was a good month between the starter deck and Duelist Alliance, but that wasn't enough time, and even then there wasn't enough hype behind Scrap Pendulum. Sure, it was being experimented with online, but because it was never something used in the OCG, which usually sets a precedent for the TCG meta, it was a totally unproven strategy. During that brief period of time where it was playable, I definitely enjoyed it. Something about it just felt cool, and the whole idea behind these scrap monsters themselves is kinda badass. I love their field spell Scrap Factory, it's even got a reference to Terminator 2 in the artwork. I actually decided to make this video after watching the movie recently. Dude, imagine never having seen Terminator 2. But after looking back at this nearly forgotten deck, I almost wonder if there's any chance it could make a splash in modern day, at least for a funny replay in Master Duel. Though even with the better Pendulum monsters that are in the game nowadays, I feel that the best option would just be to play a straight up Scrap deck with the other support that they ended up getting. I mean, as a dinosaur player, I'm no stranger to the basic Scrap engine, so I imagine that a deck full of them could at least manage. Even back then, the stars of the deck were the support cards that helped you net some insane advantage, and the Pendulums were honestly just a means of getting your monsters onto the field. The deck at its core was Scrap, not Pendulum. And I'm glad that with those additional waves of legacy monsters, they were able to outgrow the engine that was in reality just a crutch that had to be dropped in order to get better. So let me know what you thought about Scrap Pendulum, and if you remember this brew that was all the rage for a moment only to become extremely obscure in the modern day. Anyway, this is GatorX, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you all later.